Hey, what's up guys, Jamie here, and in this video we're talking about the Ionic 4 checkbox. Alright, and we're going to do a bunch of examples, including just your standard checkbox. We have a pre-checked checkbox. We have a checkbox bound to a variable in the TypeScript. And then we have a bunch of different colored checkboxes, checkboxes in a list, and then also with this checkbox which is bound to a variable in the TypeScript, it actually logs something to the console every time the value changes. Okay, so it logs false because the value is false, and then true when it's true. So we're going to be coding all of these examples from scratch, and you guys will be an expert on the Ionic checkbox by the end of this video. And let's get started. Alright, so let's get started writing the code. I just have my own blank project set up here, a blank Ionic 4 project. If you don't have your own project to work in, be sure to check out my video on getting started in Ionic, and then we'll get you all set up so that you can start using the Ionic 4 checkbox. And so the first thing we're going to do here is just get the most basic example working. Okay, and that looks exactly like this. So the only thing you need to get a checkbox working is just to simply put the ion-checkbox tag. Now don't worry, we're going to be getting into more advanced things in a second, but first I just want to show you this most basic example. So I just have a paragraph tag and then a checkbox right after it. So I'm going to go over to my page, and then here on the page we can see that the checkbox is right here below the default checkbox paragraph, and when we check it, has that nice animation, and it's colored by default the primary color of the app. And if you're wondering, by the way, where those colors come from, they are in the variables.scss. So this is the primary color right here. You can change these to your heart's desire, and we can also set the checkbox to be any one of these colors inside of the variables.scss. Okay, let's look at the next example, and this one is going to be a disabled checkbox. So to make a checkbox disabled, you can simply set this disabled property right here to true. Okay, and you can bind this to a variable if you wanted to. Maybe we can look at doing that a little bit later, but this one is just set as disabled is true. So if you do that, then that will disable the user from interacting with that checkbox. And so that might be useful if you want to disable your checkbox based on some state, like maybe the user needs to agree to something or do some sort of action before they can start using your checkbox. And so this one cannot be interacted with, but this top one still can. Alright, next example we have is the checked checkbox. Okay, so on the checkbox there's a property called checked, or an attribute I should say, and if you set it to true, then the checkbox will start out as checked. Okay, and we're going to look at binding the value of the checkbox to a variable in the TypeScript in a second, but this is just a shortcut way to just in the UI make the checkbox checked by default. I don't recommend doing this if you're binding to a variable. I'll show you how to set it to true by default if you're binding to a variable in just a second. But first I just want to show you that indeed it does start out checked right here. Okay, so now let's go on to the next example, which is configuring the colors. So like I was saying earlier, you can configure any of the colors, and this is how you do it. You just set the color attribute just like this. Okay, so I'm just going through all the colors in the rainbow of our variables.scss: primary, secondary, danger, light, and dark. Let's see how those look. And you can also bind that to a variable if you wanted to, but just make sure that the variable is a string. Okay, so I'll check these. We have primary, secondary, the danger color, the light color, and the dark color. Alright. Next example we have is checkboxes inside of a list. Okay, so if you haven't seen my video on the Ionic list, be sure to check that out, and then this will make more sense. But assuming you have some knowledge of the Ionic list, we're just going to make a for loop iterating over all of, I'll just make like a list of ingredients for like toppings on a pizza or something like that. And then we're going to repeat the item in the list for every ingredient in that list. Alright, and then inside of the item, we're going to have a label with the ingredient name, as well as we're going to have a checkbox, which is set to be at the end of the list. And then the value of the checkbox, whether it's checked or unchecked, is going to be bound to this property inside of the TypeScript, the ingredients is checked property. Alright, so this is just a list of a bunch of ingredients, and the values of whether or not they're checked is bound to part of the list in the TypeScript. Now let's go have a look at that list. So in the TypeScript, I'm going to make a list of ingredients, and then we'll say the very first one is going to be mushrooms, and then is checked is going to be false. We'll have sausage, pepperoni, and jalapenos. Okay, so you can see that each of these are basically the same. They have a name and they have an is checked, and there are just 4 of them. And so our list is going to display the ingredient's name as well as bind to the checkbox of whether or not the ingredient is checked. Okay, so this is how I would recommend, instead of setting checked to true up here like we did before, if you want a checkbox to start out as true, I recommend binding it to a variable in the TypeScript. It doesn't have to be a variable in an array, but this one is. And so just bind to the variable in the TypeScript, and then one of these is actually true by default. It's the pepperoni. So let's go and check that out on our site. Alright, so down here under our checkboxes in a list, we have pepperoni is checked by default, like I was saying, and then we have jalapenos, sausage, and mushrooms, and we can click the entire, just anywhere in the list, and it will know that it needs to check that item. Ionic is just kind of smart like that. They have configured a lot of defaults, which are really good. So like the default in this case is that you click the entire row and then it will check that box, or you can click the checkbox itself and that will also do it. So when I change these, like when I'm clicking each of these, that's updating the boolean inside of the TypeScript. It'll change this to either true or false. And so quite often you're going to want to bind to a variable. I'm going to do another example where I'm not binding to a list, I'm binding to just a single one. So I'll set another boolean variable here called like my boolean, and I'll set it equal to true initially. Okay, and then inside of the HTML, I'm going to make another example here, and then this one is going to be, I'll just place it right below the checked checkbox, and I'll say that this one is a bound checkbox, and this one is going to bind in the same way using the ng model syntax. So close bracket, ng model, and then we're going to bind to my boolean. Okay, and so this one will also be checked at first, but now it's bound to a variable. So the variable in the TypeScript will change like that checkbox if it's ever changed in the TypeScript, and if the user changes it, then it will change it back in the TypeScript as well. So it's two-way bound. Okay, so we have our bound checkbox right here, also by default checked. Okay, so that's a really important example to understand how it works. Also, if you wanted to like listen to an event of like when that button was pressed, we could also bind to the ion-change event, and then we could have that call a function called on my boolean change. Okay, and then we'll make that function over here in the TypeScript. So on my boolean change, and then we're just gonna console.log the value of my boolean. This function right here will be called every time this checkbox changes the value, and this only works when it's bound to an ng model. And so let's go check that out. We have the bound checkbox, and then when we change it around, it logs the new value, so true, so now it's true, and then I'll click it again, and now it is false. Alright, and that's all I have for this tutorial, you guys. Be sure to leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, as well as subscribe if you haven't already for more videos on Ionic and anything Angular based. I also do Fire based videos, so if you're interested in any of that stuff, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in future videos. Also, leave a comment down below what you think of the video. Always looking to improve. I'd love to know what your guys' thoughts are. And with that said, I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.